Okay, great. Let's get started. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here tonight. I'm Megan King, Preservation Austin's Programs and Outreach Planner, and I'm so excited to be here along with El Camino Real de los Tejas National Historic Trail Association, Travis Audubon, and GTI Environmental to present El Camino Connection, History and Birding in East Austin's Blair Woods. I know we have a wonderful mix of people in the audience tonight, from historians and archaeologists to birders and nature enthusiasts, and we're really excited to share this story of early Texas history uncovered in Blair Woods Nature Preserve. A quick note of housekeeping, please make sure that your microphones are muted and your cameras are turned off for the duration of the presentation to help minimize distractions. If you have any questions for our speakers, please enter them in the chat box and we'll get to them during our Q&A following our presentation. We'll also be recording this presentation to share on our social media channels in the following weeks, so be sure to follow us there to stay up to date. We are at Preservation Austin on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. I'd like to start off by welcoming our Preservation Austin members that are in attendance tonight. Thank you for supporting the work that we do to empower Austinites to shape a more inclusive, resilient, and meaningful community culture through preservation. Our members' contributions allow us not only to put on virtual programs such as this one, but also help fund our grants program that gives money directly back to the community to support projects like the archaeological survey you'll hear tonight, which was funded in part by a Preservation Austin grant awarded to El Camino Real de los Tejas National Historic Trail Association in 2020. You'll hear more about our grants program in a moment from our Development and Grants Coordinator, Leslie Walker. If you're not yet a member of Preservation Austin, I highly encourage you to join us at preservationaustin.org. While you're on our website, you can check out the host of amazing programs and initiatives that our organization has going on. One major project we're really excited about is getting our future home, the iconic McFarland House at 3805 Red River, move-in ready for our offices later this year. Preservation Austin purchased this City of Austin landmark in 2019 and have since been working to rehabilitate the home to its former glory. We believe that saving places like the McFarland House and other historic places that make Austin so unique is vital for our ever-growing city. If places like these are important to you, I invite you to join us in this work to preserve our historic fabric for generations to come by becoming a member of Preservation Austin. Today is also Amplify Austin Day. We have a campaign goal of $5,000, and Tito's Vodka is generously providing a matching grant to participating arts and culture organizations that will double the value of your contribution. You can make a donation to our campaign in honor of this special day of giving from now through tomorrow at 6 p.m. at amplifyatx.org. And now on to tonight's program. In addition to hearing from Leslie, we'll also hear from Steve Gonzales, the Executive Director of El Camino Real de los Tejas National Historic Trail Association, about the rich history of the historic El Camino Real. Following Steve, we'll hear from Nicole Netherton, Executive Director of Travis Audubon. Travis Audubon's Blair Woods has long been suspected as the site of Fort Colorado, a Republic of Texas-era fort and the site of this exciting project. Travis Audubon also contributed funding towards this archaeological study. And finally, we'll hear from our experts, the ones with their boots on the ground, Melinda and Sergio Iruegas of GTI Environmental, who performed this archaeological survey of Blair Woods through a donation of in-kind services. They will share with us the history of Fort Colorado and the incredible work they've done to unearth this long suspected but largely uncovered history. Thank you all for being here tonight and for sharing your expertise with our community. We're really so appreciative of you all. And so with that, I'm pleased to introduce Preservation Austin's Development and Grants Coordinator, Leslie Walker, who will share a bit more about our grants program and how you can apply.
Thank you, Megan. Preservation Austin is proud to support projects like the El Camino Real de los Tejas National Historic Trail Association's Archaeological Reconnaissance Survey of the Blair Woods Nature Preserve property through our grants program. In the fall of 2020, Preservation Austin awarded a Historic Resource Survey grant to El Camino Real de los Tejas National Historic Trail Association, providing essential funding for this important archaeological research. Preservation Austin has been saving what matters most in Austin since 1953, when our earlier iteration, the Austin Historical Society, invested in buildings and places that now define Austin's cultural landscape. From the Driscoll Hotel to the Elizabeth Ney Museum and the Paramount Theater, Preservation Austin has a history of supporting projects that make Austin, Austin. Since 2016, our grants program has offered matched grants up to $5,000 in 3 categories: planning, historic research survey, and local historic designation, education, and brick and mortar. Uh, Old Austin Neighborhood Association received a historic resource survey grant for historic designation research. Hyde Park Neighborhood Association received an education grant for historic street sign toppers in 2016. And we awarded a brick and mortar grant for restoration work to the Hardiman House, to the front door of the Hardiman House, located at Symphony Square, which is now the offices for Waterloo Greenway. Nonprofit organizations, neighborhood organizations, public entities, and owners of individual or proposed landmarks can apply. This program gets to the heart of our mission to empower Austinites to shape a more inclusive, resilient, and meaningful community culture through preservation. By providing small but impactful funding to important projects citywide, Preservation Austin can affect real change in our preservation and interpretation of the historic places that mean so much to our community. Grants are offered once a quarter. Applicant deadlines are December 15th, March 15th, which is obviously coming up next week, June 15th, and September 15th. This is a competitive program, and grant requests are always under $5,000. If you have any requests about our program, please reach out to me. You can reach me at leslie@preservationaustin.org. And on that note, I'm pleased to introduce Steve Gonzales, the Executive Director of El Camino Real de los Tejas National Historic Trail Association. Steve.
Thank you, Leslie. I appreciate it. Hi, my name is Steve Gonzales. I'm Executive Director of El Camino Real de los Tejas National Historic Trail Association. And I would like to thank you for joining us today. And I hope that you will find our presentation exciting and informative. I would also like to thank Preservation Austin for their financial support of our project at the Blair Woods site, and the Travis Audubon Society and GTI Environmental for partnering with us towards this endeavor. It has been a lot of fun, and I think you enjoy what we have to share. In my presentation today, I will be discussing a few things, namely a brief history of El Camino Real de los Tejas in historic times, modern events leading up to the trail's designation as a National Historic Trail, and finally what it means to be a National Historic Trail and part of the National Trail System. So with that said, let us begin. Next slide, please. So the brief history I'm going to do is going to go over some initial entradas or expeditions that the Spanish conducted in the late 1680s and early 1690s, as well as the early Anglo period of the trail. Next slide, please. So sustained Spanish focus on Texas really begins in 1685 when the Frenchman La Salle landed on the Texas coast and established Fort St. Louis on Garcitas Creek in Victoria County. The Spanish took this as an incursion into their territory, so they began sending out entradas or expedition in search of La Salle's fort, and these were done both by land and by sea. Next slide, please. Over the next several years, expeditions by sea were conducted out of places like Veracruz and Florida, but due to shallow bays and unnavigable rivers, the Spanish were unable to locate La Salle's fort this way. At the same time, these entradas were taking place by land. Next slide, please. And these were done by a gentleman named Alonso de Leon. I always like to note at this point that this is not a picture of Alonso de Leon, but rather of Francisco Pizarro, the conqueror of Peru. I've searched long and hard for photos of de Leon, but I have been unable to find any of him so far. So I just want to let you know I'm not trying to pull the wool over your eyes here. So in 1686, de Leon left the town of Cadrieta and he headed to the Rio Grande. There he followed the river to its mouth, but rather than turning north into Texas, he turned south into the direction of Veracruz and was going the wrong way. So he was unable to locate La Salle's fort this way. Yet rumors persisted among Native Americans about white men living among them. So a year later, de Leon set out in search of La Salle's fort again. And once again, he left Cadrieta. He headed to the Rio Grande and he got to the mouth. This time he followed it, instead of turning south, he headed north into Texas. And he probably got as far as present-day Baffin Bay, which is near Kingsville. And it seemed like a large impassable body of water to him. So they turned around and they said, you know what, they aren't here. You know, these are just rumors, essentially. But yet these rumors persisted, and they kept hearing from native peoples about white men living amongst them. So a year later, excuse me, they were able to capture the Frenchman Jean Jury, who was acting as a chief among some Native American tribes in the Anacacho Mountains. Next slide, please. Have we lost the slides? I'm not seeing on my end over here. Okay, I'll keep going at this point. So because they were able to locate Jean Jury with the Native Americans in the Anacacho Mountains, which are a little southeast of Del Rio, they were able to locate La Salle's fort in 1689. And it was in a complete shamble. There were 3 French bodies, including a woman still in her dress, that they found, and they gave proper burial to them all. There were French books that had their pages thrown out of them. They were strewn about the landscape. And the famous French cannons that had been discovered recently via archaeological surveys were discovered at that time and buried by the Spanish in case of the French return. And next slide, please. We should be going to one that has a picture of Maria de Greda, the lady in blue. I'm sorry, I cannot see any slides on my end. And so of this famed 1689 expedition, Spanish colonial historian Carlos Castaneda states that it truly marks the beginnings of Texas, because this was the first time that Spanish forces had penetrated as far as the Guadalupe River. And around the same time, according to Spanish records, Maria de Agreda, the lady in blue, miraculously appeared to the Tejas in East Texas and said to them that they should seek out the Spanish so that they could learn about the Catholic faith. Therefore, in 1690, after having received word from the Tejas that they were seeking to meet with the Spanish, de Leon journeyed to the Neches River to meet with them on June the 1st of that year. So Mission San Francisco de los Tejas and Spanish missionary aspirations had been established in Texas. And this also marked the initial blazing of portions of the Camino Real. Next slide, please. Over the next several years, the Camino became a major route of travel. In 1700, the Mission and Presidio of San Juan Bautista was founded on the Rio Grande. And by 1714, the French established Natchitoches on the eastern end of the trail. And this in turn caused the Spanish to establish Los Adais, the first capital of Texas, in 1717. And this was essentially 2 European powers standing off in what they considered to be the wilderness, even though they were surrounded by Native American people. So as you can see, the road was becoming a major thoroughfare and facilitating trade and travel. And if we fast forward about 100 years, it allowed Anglo settlers to come into Texas along it. Next slide, please. So in 1820, Moses Austin journeyed down the Camino to San Antonio to obtain a Spanish land grant. And around that same time, many Anglo-American settlers began coming into Texas at places like Gaines Ferry on the Sabine River and heading into Nacogdoches, San Antonio, and other places along the road. Even famed Alamo combatant Davy Crockett came down the trail to San Antonio, and it can be said that if he had not met his fate at that battle, that he would have continued down the trail to the Rio Grande, because in his last known letter, he said exactly that. So as I said, that's a brief history of the trail. If you would like to learn more about its history, please visit our website, which is elcaminotrail.org, and click on our News and Events tab. And there you can find a sublink with over 500 reference materials about the trail and its history. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to talk about some modern events leading up to the trail's designation as a National Historic Trail and what it means to be part of the National Trail System. So in 1991, the Texas legislature formed the Old San Antonio Road Preservation Commission, and that commission instructed TxDOT to survey the condition of the Camino Real. This was done to commemorate the 300th anniversary of the Entrada that De Leon conducted in 1690. And that study, which you can see pictured here, determined that there were at least 5 additional routes of the trail that were used at various times. The study also served as a basis for the National Park Service to conduct a feasibility study to determine if the Camino was eligible to be designated as a National Historic Trail. That feasibility study determined that the Camino did meet that criteria, so that on October 18, 2004, El Camino Real de los Tejas was designated as a National Historic Trail and part of the National Trail System. Next slide, please. So this begs the question, What is the National Trail System? The National Trail System was established by the National Trail System Act of 1968 and signed into law by a Texan, President LBJ. And today that system is composed of 30 national scenic and historic trails. Next slide, please. There are 11 national scenic trails, such as the Appalachian Trail, the Pacific Crest Trail, and the Continental Divide Trail. And there are 19 national historic trails, which are trails such as the Camino Real de los Tejas, the Oregon Trail, the Santa Fe Trail, and the Trail of Tears. Each of these trails takes an act of the U.S. Congress to designate it as nationally significant. And in the case of the Camino Real, it's because it's the road that led to the founding of Texas, and we would not be calling Texas, Texas without it today. Another thing to note on this map is that our trail is the only national historic trail that's in the core of the state. There's another Camino Real called El Camino Real de Tierra Adentro, which just barely skirts through El Paso before heading to Santa Fe. And because of this, Texas is a hotbed for national historic trail development right now. Trails such as the Chisholm and Great Western Cattle Trails, the Butterfield Overland Stage Route, the Pike Trail, and even Route 66 all have feasibility studies being conducted to determine their NHT and eligibility. Therefore, this map will likely change in the future, but this is our understanding of the trail system at this time. Next slide, please. So what is a National Historic Trail? According to the National Trail System Act, a National Historic Trail is an extended trail that must follow as closely as possible the original route of historic travel. And this is how a historic trail like the Camino differs from a scenic trail like the Appalachian. When they're building a scenic trail like the Appalachian on the ground, they can essentially go wherever they need to get that trail built. Whereas with a historic trail like the Camino, because it is based on a historic route of travel, we couldn't say build a trail from Austin to Dallas and call it the Camino, because historically it never went that way. Next slide, please. So what does the Trail System Act say about the Camino Real? It says that in general, it's 2,580 miles of route extending from the Rio Grande near Eagle Pass and Laredo to Natchitoches, Louisiana. Next slide, please. So in closing, I would like to encourage you to visit our website, elcaminotrail.org, and learn more about us and what we're doing. Hopefully you'll find that we're worthy of your support, and you'll be willing to make a donation or become a member today. I also have my contact information listed here in case you have more questions or comments. And at this time, I would like to turn it over to Nicole Netherton, Executive Director of the Travis Audubon Society. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve. Hi, everyone. I'm Nicole Netherton, Executive Director of Travis Audubon, and I'm proud to be here tonight representing Austin's oldest environmental organization. We have been inspiring conservation through birding since 1952. I know we have many Travis Audubon members joining us here tonight, but if you are not yet a member and are interested in the work we're doing for wildlife conservation in Central Texas, I invite you to join us on some bird walks as the pandemic improves. You can find out more about our work at travisaudubon.org. We're here tonight because of our connection with the history you've already been hearing about right here in our backyard. Our urban sanctuary, Blair Woods, is a 10-acre preserve on East MLK, the center of our education programming and an oasis in a rapidly developing part of East Austin. Blair Woods is such a special place for birders because it is a wonderful site to experience nature right in the middle of Austin. The most recent count of wild bird species seen at Blair Woods is 134, and walking there is like stepping outside of the city, aside from occasional sounds of planes overhead. We're excited about the way this archaeological study connects with our lovely birding spot to important parts of Texas history. So let's begin by going back in time to 1985, when this property was gifted to Travis Audubon as part of the estate of Dr. Frank and Fern Blair, seen here wishing us happy holidays. Frank Blair was a prominent zoologist from UT Austin, an expert in reptiles and amphibians, and the author of many books on zoology, including The Rusty Lizard. His wife, Fern, was an avid birder and outdoors woman. The Blairs lived on this property from the 1950s until their deaths, and they loved the land because of the wildlife that can be found there, but also because it had this important role in Texas history. We can step back in time to 1836, when Fort Colorado was founded in the Republic of Texas. The Blairs long had suspicions that the fort had been located near their land, in part because of the location of Coleman Springs, a gravel seep on the property that almost always contains water. Returning to the present day, Travis Audubon helped fund this archaeological study because we believe it is an important part of our mission to uncover more of the rich history at Blair Woods. This knowledge can only add to our and others' enjoyment of the nature there. Dr. Drew Lanham, a prominent ornithologist, talks about how nature can't be separated from the history of a particular place, and we find this to be true at Blair Woods. Paraphrasing Dr. Lanham, there are stories in the birds and in the habitat as it was changed. We can travel back through time and understand both where we are now and how we can protect our birds for the future. Learning more about El Camino and Fort Colorado helps us be good stewards of the gifts the Blairs gave our organization. And we believe this work also honors the legacy of Frank and Fern and all the people who came before them at what we now call Blair Woods. So I hope you'll visit Blair Woods for a nature walk during migration this spring and imagine how the stories of birds and humans are connected through time at this special place. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Sergio and Melinda Iruegas of GTI Environmental, our guests of honor who've done the hard and dirty archaeological work to uncover some of the history of Blair Woods that we'll hear about tonight. So thank you, and hello, Sergio and Melinda.
Thank you, Nicole. Hello and welcome, and thank you for coming to our presentation. I am Melinda Iruegas.
And I'm Sergio Iruegas.
I'm going to open our presentation with a brief history of how we became involved in the Fort Colorado project. And then Sergio and I want to share some historical highlights of the archival and archaeological studies, so we can see why Fort Colorado is an important ecological and archaeological site. Our company, GTI Environmental LLC, share the same goals of preserving Texas cultural and ecological history, and we provide a 1-to-3 match in services in kind for grant-funded projects, such as the Fort Colorado Archival and Archaeological Studies. Preservation laws not only deal with historic buildings and archaeology sites, the laws and regulations also say that an environmental setting can be an important cultural resource too, when historic groups of people have a relational attachment to the landscape. Fort Colorado is a significant archaeology site and ecology site because of the natural spring and habitat, which was important to the soldiers of Fort Colorado and to the indigenous people of Texas. Dr. Frank and Fern Blair owned the property, which is known as the Blair Wood Nature Preserve. Fern Blair collected oral histories from the Mower family, who were the previous landowners, and she was well aware Fort Colorado was on her property. Miss Blair worked for the University of Tulsa Library cataloging its resources, and she was meticulous in her data collection. Her system of cataloging was very similar to the methods and standards of oral history collection. According to Fern Blair, Susan Mower said her father used some of the old wood from the fort to build their home and outbuildings in the late 19th century. Back in 1965, Mrs. Blair shared some of these stories with an archaeologist who conducted the first excavations of the fort area for a housing development project north of Martin Luther King Boulevard. At that time, the archaeologist did not find the footprint of the fort. Ms. Blair also shared with the archaeologist some artifacts from her property that dated to the ad interim government of Texas between 1836 and 1838, which suggested some parts of the fort are within the nature preserve. The Travis Audubon Society asked Sergio and I to do some in-depth archival research, and we determined there was a very high probability that portions of the walled fort were inside the nature preserve property, just like Fern Blair had documented.
We have discovered in our studies that indigenous peoples of Texas and early European settlers collaborated more often than previously thought. We find this to be true during the Spanish colonial period, and these native coalitions seem to be the case at Fort Colorado. According to Spanish expedition journals, over 2,500 people lived in a large native village about 2/3 of a mile north of the Colorado River. In 1709, Captain Pedro de Aguirre traveled on El Camino Real, which was close to the Montopolis Bridge in East Austin, and he described a large half-moon shaped village with over 150 huts. By 1716, Captain Domingo Ramon came to the Colorado River and traveled along the north and south banks as far as the area close to Bastrop, and he reported that he met people on both sides of the river. In 1806, Captain Zebulon Pike traveled on the same road, and he saw the same indigenous people living in the area as well as a fortified Spanish rancho settlement. The rancho represented the outskirt pasture land boundary associated with the Via de Mina, which today is known as Bastrop. The ethnohistorical records strongly suggest an ancillary road segment of El Camino Real connected Fort Colorado soldiers with the indigenous peoples of Texas, who lived at the large native village west of the fort.
After arriving in Texas in May of 1831, Robert M. Coleman filed a formal petition on February 8, 1834, to live permanently in the Republic of Mexico within Austin's colony. His petition followed a process developed from antecedent Spanish laws and regulations. As an impresario, Stephen F. Austin's colonists complied with the stipulations of the 1573 Ordinance of Discovery, New Settlements, and Peace, and the regulations under the 1691 Entrada instructions.
While serving as the alcalde de la Villa de Mina and the presidente del Ayuntamiento de Mina, Robert M. Coleman gained the knowledge and ability to work within the Spanish and native treaty system of governance for civil communities. Villa de Mina is known today as Bastrop.
Shortly after the Battle of San Jacinto in 1836, General Sam Houston appointed his aide-de-camp, Robert M. Coleman, as the commander in charge of the ad interim government system of forts. As the newly appointed colonel, Coleman was responsible for the development of the military installations within his jurisdiction, which extended from the Colorado River to the Trinity River.
Colonel Coleman established a system of forts surrounding the indigenous large commercial center of Rancheria Grande, according to Spanish laws and treaty agreements from the previous century. The forts were located at least one-day ride from the commercial center boundary. Spanish court records from 1771 to 1783 quantified these regulated minimum distances of 8 leagues or 21 miles. Forts founded on these earlier treaty principles were prosperous. Rancheria Grande encompassed the general area of the upper and lower roads of El Camino Real within Milam, Robertson, Burleson, and Brazos counties. The commercial center was an important indigenous community asset, and all trade from east to west flowed through the commercial center. To manage, maintain, and protect trade along El Camino Real, Colonel Coleman strategically situated Fort Colorado much further away along the upper road between the native villages of Rancheria Grande and closer to the Half Moon Village in East Austin. The colonel ordered the military men to establish the other forts according to the minimum required distances beyond Rancheria Grande boundaries, and the soldiers had to clear and build new roads which connected the forts to El Camino Real. From this position, the Fort Colorado was able to regulate the transportation of trade goods along the road. Colonel Coleman was prescient by establishing this system of military forts that circumscribed the indigenous territory, which the former Spanish Treaty of 1718 recognized as Rancheria Grande tribal lands. The fort locations reformalized the antecedent treaty and circumvented these tribal lands by setting them aside for the indigenous people of Texas once again. The Bird's Fort Treaty Ratification Proclamation of 1843 listed foreign tribes that migrated into Texas, such as the Apache, Comanche, and Waco, and qualified the original people of Texas as other tribes. The system of forts controlled the area in terms of commerce with the Anglo-European settlements outside the tribal lands. By this time, the United States diplomats and the Texas congressmen considered tribal lands as a buffer between the Republic of Texas and southwestern tribes who were already allies with the Republic of Mexico. Fort Colorado was a fulcrum, which ameliorated the United States recognition of Spain's sovereignty over Texas in the Onus-Adams Treaty of 1819 to 1821. With the United States secession of Florida from Spain, the independence of Texas from the Republic of Mexico was the last impediment of manifest destiny. The founding of Fort Colorado in 1836 and establishment of the new capital at Waterloo in 1839 was a military event that shifted the balance of control and commerce on El Camino Real from the former capital of the Provincia de Tejas in San Antonio to the new capital of the Republic of Texas in Austin. Based on our previous archival study, we assessed there was a high probability the northwestern corner of the Fort Palisade Wall was within the Blair Woods Nature Preserve property boundary.
The modern aerial of the Blair Woods Nature Preserve shows clusters of trees very much as it did when Dr. Frank and Fern Blair owned the property. The 1716 Spanish expedition journals described a similar environmental setting of trees in this area north of the Colorado River. As historical archaeologists, we analyze historic aerial photographs in relation to possible archaeological site footprints. We use the archival study as the basis for understanding these culturally modified vegetation patterns in the 1954 aerial image. As you can see in this photograph, a farmer constructed curving trenches up to Martin Luther King Boulevard for soil erosion control. We recognized a linear vegetation pattern forming a 90-degree angle bisecting the curving rows of trenches. The linear pattern was the first indicator of the fort's possible footprint. The straight alignment of this earlier pattern formed a rectangle of vegetation. We highlighted this pattern with a yellow line. When we increase the transparency of the historic aerial overlay on the modern image, you can see how the tree line maintained the old farmer's curving tree trench patterns. Bushes and tree lines often conform to old fence lines. In this case, a potential pattern of Fort Colorado's palisade walls. Noah Smithwick's daughter transcribed, next slide, please. The previous slide, please. No, the next slide. There you go. Thank you. Noah Smithwick's daughter transcribed her father's memoir, and she drew an image of the fort based on his memory, and which shows archaeologists what to look for on the ground. The artist's perspective of the military installation drawing is from the northwest looking towards the southeast. That meant the blockhouse and wall alignment, as seen in the drawing, would be in the northwest corner of the fort. If the vegetation pattern represents the palisade wall alignment, the northwest corner of the fort would be in the Blair Woods Nature Preserve. As we prepared for field work, we noticed one of two possible alignment patterns might represent the fort walls. We highlighted the initial possible wall with an orange dashed line. The blue dashed line, however, suggested a wall pattern as well, or possibly the entrance path.
Knowing where the Blair Woods Nature Preserve property lines were at in the landscape in relation to the possible fort wall alignment was important, so that's where we began to dig. In the first excavation unit, we found evidence of a compact earthen surface with indigenous lithic reduction flakes resting on the floor. The floor suggested the possibility that we were inside the blockhouse or some kind of activity area nearby, but there was no evidence of a foundation trench for the wall. We found a similar compact earthen surface in another excavation unit, and we discovered 3 lithic artifacts resting on the floor. Indigenous people made these lithic artifacts. The artifact at the bottom of the picture was an arrow shaft straightener. Noah Smithwick told the story in his memoir that he worked closely with the Comanche, and other indigenous people came to the fort. As part of the archaeological survey effort, we reconnoitered the general area and saw some evidence of native cooking hearths nearby. Could these hearths features be associated with Fort Colorado? Part of the hidden narrative of the early Spanish colonial period is that indigenous people collaborated with settlers. They worked together, and the local people helped build the Spanish missions. Scholars have shown that late prehistoric and historic indigenous peoples of Texas had sophisticated culture and modes of coalition development. If the local native people helped Spanish in the early 1700s, is it possible they also helped Anglo-European colonists in the early 1800s? The historical archaeology of military sites and other places within the United States has discovered similar collaborative interactions between settlers and native peoples. This hypothesis would explain the presence of indigenous cultural material where the fort's blockhouse was potentially located, but the excavation units didn't have European artifacts, at least so far.
In past excavation efforts, we used metal detecting to search for European artifacts along swale remnants of El Camino Real. The National Park Service approved this type of method for excavation in New Mexico. We successfully applied this survey methodology at Lobanillo Swales back in 2015. At Fort Colorado, we applied this methodology in a block pattern that included both potential wall alignments. After flagging and mapping 10 metal detecting targets, a linear pattern emerged, which followed the rectangular alignment of the possible fort wall. The additional survey effort led deeper into the woods in an area we had not seen before, and we recognized a characteristic swale pattern of the historic trail leading down to Coleman Springs. The swale represents an ancillary route of El Camino Real, leading from the main road to the natural spring.
This map shows the location of the initial 4 shovel tests and the 10 metal detecting targets in conjunction with the indigenous cooking hearths. All the shovel tests at these targets revealed historic artifacts, except for one metal detecting target, number 10, which was an old Jiffy Pop aluminum tin pan. We want to take some time to describe how we assessed early 19th century date to some of the artifacts. At first, the artifacts may seem more modern, but laboratory analysis showed earlier characteristics from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. The artifacts from metal detecting target number 1 are a good example. What appeared to be a typical wood screw was in fact contemporary with Fort Colorado. On August 11, 1718, John Andrews from Dinwiddie County, Virginia, filed a patent for a screw cutting machine with a drawing of what the screw looked like. Although John Wyatt invented the semi-automatic machine that fabricated these screws in 1751, the major advance in the development of deep cut buttress threads was invented circa 1826. The wood screw we found has these characteristic deep threads spread further apart. Spacing of threads on more recent screws are typically shallow and closer together. The wood screw came from the same shovel test with one other artifact, which also included an unusually shaped semi-spherical lithic core object.
The archival research documented the soldiers of Fort Colorado also had coalitions with the Waco and other ethnic groups that immigrated down into Texas from the northeastern area of the United States. With this in mind, a possible interpretation of the round lithic core may be that the object functioned as the ball of a war club. The Native War Club is part of the cultural material assemblages at other military sites in the United States, and the objects remained in use into the 19th century. The other excavation example we wanted to emphasize was the artifact pattern closer to the possible corner of the fort wall. We excavated this metal detecting target location as a shovel test because it was directly adjacent to the rectangular wall alignment and one of the native cooking hearths. The excavations uncovered a similar compact earthen surface seen elsewhere, and the artifacts were resting flat on the floor. We recognize the bone object in the northern part of the excavation unit as a fragment of a scapula or a shoulder blade. After cleaning the object during analysis, it was clear the indigenous person purposefully formed the bone into a tool. Finding this object was exciting because other practitioners of historical archaeology of military sites found scapula hoes at other historic military installations. The bone tool was resting on the floor next to one of the cast iron bolts we recovered, which was the missing link between indigenous and European artifacts we were looking for.
We assessed the manufacture date of the handmade cast iron rivets to the time of Fort Colorado. Antoine Durinet invented and patented his machine-made rivets in 1836. The whitish-gray color on the bolt shaft indicated it was cast iron and dates to the early 19th century. XRF elemental analysis of the rivet indicated the metal artifact was definitively cast iron with no modern alloys. The archival research demonstrated that in January 1836, Colonel Robert M. Coleman ordered Smithwick and soldiers to the general location of Fort Colorado to assist with the construction. Therefore, it is very possible Noah Smithwick probably handmade these rivets as Fort Colorado's blacksmith. Archaeologists found one other rivet with the same handmade head showing upward tension. The shaft was the same length, and the opposite head on both rivets was sheared off. The consistency of the shaft length suggested the soldiers, or Smithwick, used the rivets to fasten wooden planks that measured 2.5 inches thick. According to Noah Smithwick's memoir, he had a mill with the capacity to furnish cut lumber in sizes needed for the fort walls. Results of every archaeological investigation always reveal something unanticipated. In this case, the indigenous cooking hearths next to the buried compact earthen surfaces and the arrow shaft straightener suggested collaborative tasks between soldiers and local indigenous people occurred next to the fort. The cultural material assemblage patterns of other military sites also included cooking installations inside the structures. The cooking hearths we observed outside the possible blockhouse may be an iteration of this pattern representing military life during the early Republic of Texas. Another important discovery was a swale alignment leading to Coleman Springs that parallel the possible wall of Fort Colorado. After we completed the artifact analysis and considered how the soldiers and early farmers left the objects on the ground, we looked at the historic aerial photograph again. We could see possible swale remnant evidence in a northwestward direction, which would make this trail an ancillary road of El Camino Real. With this evidence of the ancillary road connecting with El Camino Real, the National Park Service can use this data to designate the Fort Colorado as a certified National Historic Trail site.
Fern Blair collected oral history tells us that previous landowners held the property for generations, and they reused the wood from the fort to rebuild their farms. The cast iron rivets were missing the opposite head and showed evidence someone clipped the head off. The rivets and other artifacts from the early 19th century followed the alignment of the potential fort wall. Is it possible when the early farmers reused the wood, they simply left the rivets where they fell? On behalf of El Camino Real de los Tejas National Historic Trail Association, we would like to thank Preservation Austin and the Travis Audubon Society for funding the Reconnaissance Archaeological Survey of Fort Colorado. The project has an exciting future because this study demonstrates further investigations have the potential to reveal important archaeology for Texas history and a more balanced narrative of how the indigenous people, soldiers of Fort Colorado, and European settlers worked together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melinda and Sergio. Thank you. That was really wonderful. And thank you all for bearing with our minor technical difficulties there. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat of the Q&A. I'll invite our presenters or our other presenters to start asking any questions in the meantime.
Yes, thank you so much, Sergio and Melinda. That was great. I really enjoyed it. I'm wondering if you can tell us some more about the continuity of the indigenous habitation of the area.
Yes, so the continuity that we saw in the excavations was based on the fact that the bone tool was found in the same context as the cast iron rivet. And so that's how we know that the two cultures were actually interacting with each other.
Perfect. So please, anybody, I invite you to add any questions into the chat. I did have a quick question as well for Sergio and Melinda. So how do you know as archaeologists that the historic bolt is associated, the one that we've seen in the previous slides, is associated with the native cultural material that was also located nearby and not from earlier?
That's a good question. The native cultural material, the lithic reduction flakes, the arrow shaft straightener, the bone tool, as well as the cast iron rivets were all found basically at the same elevation and obviously on the same surface, that compact earthen surface that we were finding. So that's how we know that they were all interconnected.
Perfect, thank you. So we have one question. Is there a location on the trail where we can observe the archaeological site? And maybe Travis Audubon wants to field this one.
It's not marked. um, we're discouraging people from poking around there too much right now, but it's our goal in the future to have signage explaining both the connection to the Blairs and Fort Colorado around there. So that's all in development, but because this is so new, it's not currently marked.
We have one more set asking, what was life like at the fort and how long was it active for?
Another great question. The fort was actually in existence from 1836 to 1838.
And what was life like there? I think there's the memoirs, right? Is there any accounting of the life there?
Right. So Noah Smithwick actually provided a lot of the information detailing what life was like. He documented Native people coming to visit the fort and interacting with them. He described over time, it was really fascinating. He grew as a person over time, and he actually was adopted by one of the Comanche people that he was medicine man that he was working with as essentially like a brother. And his experiences, he actually worked with General Houston on treaty efforts. So there's this whole idea that, you know, the forts were put in place to protect all the other people that were around. But what we've noted in looking at Smithwick and even Erath's memoirs was the fact that people were a little more collaborative. And you look at the communities that developed around that area. You look at Weberville, you look at Hornsby Bend. These people were all surviving together. And so it's really, to me, it's a really incredible story.
Yeah, the ethnohistorical record provides a lot more information on the collaborative aspects of interaction between the settlers and the native people that live there than what has been looked at before. I'd also like to add in terms about living, what was life like? Smithwick had described how they built these tents and they used hides, most likely buffalo hides, for the actual floors, and so those were sleeping areas.
Can I make one quick comment about what you were saying about sort of exploring alternate narratives about the collaboration between Native peoples and the settlers? For those of you who've been to Blair Woods, you might have seen there's a historical marker that was placed near, it's now on the right of way on the side of Blair Woods, but it was placed nearby there in 1936. And the text on there has always been sort of problematic for us because it talks about how the fort was intended to protect the settlers from, quote, savage Indians. And I just want to thank Sergio and Melinda because I think a lot of the work that they have been doing has been serving to change that narrative. And, you know, that wasn't that long ago that was sort of the prevailing attitude. And I'm very grateful that you are sort of shedding light on something that's a lot more complex than fighting between settlers and savage Indians.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm wondering if y'all might comment on, do y'all have any indication that Zebulon Pike's journey through Texas might have informed where the location of the fort was determined to be in the end?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. We've gone through Zebulon Pike's journal as part of a project, and basically he describes how he went along the road, and we measured the distances, so we know that the actual trail alignment is accurate because everywhere he stopped and described the environment, it seemed to match those distances. When he gets to the Colorado River and crosses north, he immediately starts to say that he came across some of the same, what he calls huts, of at least 40 of them, and that there was that fortified Spanish rancho settlement there in that same general area. And so Fort Colorado is literally less than a half mile away from the National Historic Trail alignment. And to see the swale going down to the spring and then looking at the historic aerial again, and then seeing beyond the Blair Woods, further up north of MLK, seeing, you know, we've done this enough to where you could see almost at that point, you could definitely see what looks like the trail alignment, and it's heading over to the National Historic Trail segment. And so that part was the general area that Captain Zebulon Pike was traveling through.
So we have a few more questions coming in. One person is asking, can we read Noah Smithwick's memoirs, and where would those be?
Absolutely.
Yes, you can. I want to say archive.org. I know that there's a couple of sources out there. You can actually Google it online, and it's Noah Smithwick. You can also take a look at Bernard Erath, because he served under Smithwick, and he actually provides a lot of more intricate details of the tents and the utensils and the things, because Smithwick sent, Colonel Coleman sent Erath out to go establish the Little River Fort. And he gave him very limited resources. And he talks about the other things that he had to do in order to be able to complete his task. So both of those are available online. I know that Erath is available through Google Books. But Smithwick, you will have to do a search, and it might be available on archive.org.
Thank you. So I have this question for Steve. Can Steve speak more about the Lady in Blue?
Frida Greta, the Lady in Blue. Yes, she was born in Agreda, Spain, and never came to the Americas, but there was multiple reports of her miraculously appearing throughout the Americas to indigenous peoples and suggesting to them that they should seek out the Spanish and learn about the Catholic faith. It happened here on the Camino Real de los Tejas around 1690 with the Tejas people in deep East Texas. It's also said to have happened in places like La Junta de los Rios, which is in West Texas, where the Rio Conchos meets the Rio Grande in the Big Bend area of Texas, and as well as other places in more central Mexico and South America. So she's a very interesting figure. She was a woman of really devout faith. And they say that through her faith, somehow she was able to miraculously, what they called biolocate, essentially transport herself to the Americas so she could speak with these native peoples about the Catholic faith and try to get them to learn more about it.
Yeah, her story is so fascinating. I have a kind of two-parter question. How do historical markers get changed to reflect changing history views? And how can you engage the local community to care about this history and know about it more? This is an open question, I guess, maybe to Steve or Sergio and Melinda.
I can answer part of that. We have seen historical markers revised at different times and relocated as new understandings come into place. It just depends on the support of the local community and the need to address those kinds of issues. In regard to them, some of these markers occasionally being in incorrect locations. I know, for instance, in Milam County, near the San Javier Mission Complex, there were several markers that were relocated in that area, probably, 10 or 12 years ago, I'm going to say, because they had been placed initially where they thought the mission sites may have been, but after more research was conducted and there were newer understandings, those things were replaced. And so I think that the narratives could be changed out somewhat easily. It would take working with the local county historic commissions and other historians in the area, and then of course coming up with the funding to make changes on those panels.
And I can speak to this particular marker. We have talked to our friends at the Historical Commission about both moving and repairing the marker, and we don't have a solution about how to adjust the narrative there. But because it's also a part of the history of Texas, that marker was placed at the centennial of the state, and I think sometimes there's something to be said for interpreting a former interpretation. So there might be an opportunity for us to move it more within the sanctuary and then be able to explain. That gives a real opportunity to be able to share new ideas with people by keeping it in some way, but modifying it, adding to it.
I have a minor addition to answer that question. The Marker History Programs Division in the Texas Historical Commission have staff that deal with that, those kinds of issues. And you could easily contact them and let them know and ask them what the procedures would be to amend or redo the entire marker in terms of the write-up. And typically it's you know, the cost involved of replacing that cast iron plaque and then the person redoing the write-up.
Thank you. Yeah, and we have Bess Graham in the chats also giving us that same information, that the centennial markers are under the purview of the Texas Historical Commission, and to contact Bob Brinkman in the history program. Thank you so much for that, Bess.
Bob Brinkman is fantastic. Yeah.
Okay, I have we have quite a few questions, but I'll ask maybe a fun one. Do you have a favorite bird, plant, or other animal that you've seen in Blair Woods in your work there?
Do y'all have any? I have a ton. And any Audubon members who are in there, feel free to add some to the chat. My favorite story about birding at Blair Woods is I was meeting one of our board members, Mark Wilson, who's very involved in the project, and I saw he had his binoculars on as I pulled into the driveway, and he was like, come on. And so I grabbed my binoculars and we looked, and we saw a big group of Baltimore Orioles feeding in a tree.
Wow.
They had dropped down the night before during migration, and we both had never seen that many Baltimore Orioles together in one place before. So just goes to show during migration, magical things can happen. I also really love Blair Woods is a great place for when things are in bloom. We have a pollinator garden, beautiful native plants, agarita, Turk's cap, all those favorites. But I like to look for fungus there. We get, depending on the rain that we get all sorts of really amazing fungus and slime molds and things. So if you can look up for the birds and down for the strange fungus growing on the ground. It's a lot of fun.
That's awesome.
Okay, I have one last question. We have just 3 minutes left. So when and why did the collaborative relationship between the indigenous people and the settlers end?
I believe the collaborative aspect didn't end. The people wound up marrying together in some cases. And a lot of times the communities are somewhat hidden and in the background, and it just hasn't been recognized as such because the studies haven't been done for that. But it pretty much began in 1691 with the recognition of the discovery of a suitable location in accordance with the 1573 ordinances, and from then on, the laws required that the indigenous people had to request the area be selected for a mission. And if you look at all of those Spanish journals, you begin to see how some of those requests were actually documented, and then that's basically the beginning of it. And it continued on through the Mexican Republic, through the Texas Republic.
Well, with that, I think I will say thank you to everybody, Sergio, Melinda, Nicole, Steve, and Leslie for being here. And thank you to all of our participants in the chat with all of your questions. I'm not even sure we got to every single one of them, but I encourage you to follow up if you'd like to know some more. But thank you so much, everybody, for being here, and have a great night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.